Good evening or afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's book talk for We Are Not Strangers. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you were able to, you will visit the museum in person to see our current and upcoming exhibitions, including Art of Freedom, the life and work of Arthur Szyk, which is opening on December 7th, 2025. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So that is the Zoom Q&A box, not the chat. Today, we are so honored to be joined by Josh Tuininga. Josh is an author, artist, and designer living in North Bend, Washington. After studying fine art at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, he founded an art and design agency where he continues to work as its creative director. His work has been published in Communication Arts Magazine and How Design Magazine, and he was awarded with the Communication Arts Award for Excellence in Illustration. He is the author of the children's books Why Blue and Dream On. We Are Not Strangers, which was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award, is his first graphic novel. And you can purchase We Are Not Strangers at the link in the chat, which I highly encourage you to do. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And now I'm going to hand things over to Josh.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for having me. Thanks, Sydney, so much for setting this up. Really excited to share this story with your community. So here, let me go ahead and just share my screen here. Take a second. This is because I have a very visual presentation today. All right, how does that look?
That looks great.
We're looking good? Okay, great. All right, well, let's get started. Let's just dive into it. So I'm here to talk about my graphic novel, which is called We Are Not Strangers. And this project started in my Uncle Marco's West Seattle kitchen as he was making his famous fresh caught fish and chips for me and my family. And as my uncle cooked his dinner, he told me the story of his grandfather, his papu, a Sephardic Jewish immigrant from Turkey who arrived here in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1900s. Here in the Northwest, that's where I'm speaking from. So his papu arrived here in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1900s. And my uncle, he went on to tell me about attending his papu's funeral. And it was a typical Sephardic Jewish event. Close family and friends, relatives he hadn't seen in years, tons of familiar faces. But there were some people that were arriving that he didn't recognize at all. So a handful of Japanese American guests began to arrive, and nobody knew who they were or why they came. And what Marco found out is that his papu had helped these families when they were forced out of the neighborhood and incarcerated during World War II. So his story only took a few minutes to tell me, but for the next few days, I really just couldn't stop thinking about this. I kept asking myself, how does a Jewish immigrant with family still overseas threatened by the Holocaust end up helping out his Japanese American neighbors here at home? Did they stay in touch after the war? Were there other similar stories like this? So I had a ton of questions. So I went back to interview my uncle, Marco, to get some more information. This is a drawing of him. And, together we started to do some research, see if we could find out more about the story. So we were talking to our families and people from the old neighborhood to see if we could dig up some more details about his papu's history and find out what happened. And so I knew that Marco was named after his papu, Marco Calvo, who was a Sephardic Jewish immigrant. And his papu had spent the beginning of his life on the small fishing island of Marmara. But the region was becoming really unstable for Jews at the time. So Marco and many other Sephardic Jews came to America in hopes of a better life. And many of them arrived right here in the Pacific Northwest. I went into the Ellis Island immigration database and found his official immigration documents from when Marco Calvo immigrated to Seattle in 1920. And we knew that when he was young, he lived in the Central District, and he worked at the Pike Place fishing markets, which at the time were primarily Japanese and Jewish owned. And we knew that Marco Calvo owned and ran the Ferry Dock Tavern, which was down at Pier 52, down by the waterfront. And we were talking to several people who remembered him. And, so we were digging up all kind of these vague details here and there. But as the weeks were going by, we just weren't really getting that far. Seattle had changed a lot since the 1940s, and the people who would have a lot more information about the story had died a long time ago. But I kept asking around, and as I talked to people, I kept hearing this name pop up in conversations. I'd hear, "Have you talked to Devin Narr? You have got to go see Professor Narr at University of Washington." And so I decided to look him up. And Devin is the professor of Sephardic Jewish Studies here at University of Washington. He's the author of several books about Sephardic Jewish history in the Seattle area. So I decided to reach out to Professor Narr and see if he had any advice for starting this project. And he agreed to meet up with me on campus. And this first meeting with Professor Narr is when I realized that this project was about a lot more than just some family folklore. Devin started talking about the parallels between the Sephardic Jewish and Japanese communities in Seattle. And I started to learn about the Seattle Central District specifically, which was a place where immigrants and minorities who were blocked from living elsewhere had the opportunity to get to know each other as friends and neighbors. And as I started to learn about this area, I started learning about other stories of people who reached out to help their neighbors during the war. So yeah, at that first meeting, Professor Narr gave me tons of resources and information. He encouraged me to start looking deeper into my own family history. So yeah, word of warning, if you reach out to a historian for advice about an art project, they're going to give you a ton of homework. That's what happened to me. And I'm really glad he did, though. When I first heard this story, I thought it was just a simple story about a Jewish guy who helps out his neighbors. But once I started researching, it was clear that this story was about more than that. It was about the type of environment that kind of creates that kind of remarkable relationship. And so I discovered these maps of the Seattle Central District, which kind of highlight just how unique of an area this was. So these maps are based on a house-to-house survey, which was conducted in 1939. You can see how they're kind of concentrated neighborhoods. Sephardic Jews, Japanese. So there's pockets where kind of people lived, but they all kind of overlapped each other. And people from different backgrounds and cultures lived right up against each other in this community. I should take a second and talk about Sephardic Jews. Not sure how many people are listening. If there's any Sephardic Jews in the audience, maybe you can throw that in the chat. Depends on where I do talks. A lot of people don't know there are different subcultures, Jewish cultures. And I'll just go through a little of the basics. So when most people think of Jewish culture, they think of matzo ball soup, speaking Yiddish. Those are Ashkenazic Jews, Jewish people originating from Central and Eastern Europe. And Sephardic Jews come from Spain and Portugal and the Middle East. The fundamentals are the same, but they have different customs and foods. And this was something I was really, really excited about representing in this story. Because the main character of the story is based on my family history. So it's based on Sephardic Jews who come from fishing islands in the Mediterranean. And those who immigrated to Seattle found opportunities in the fish markets at Pike Place Market. So the fish markets were this opportunity for immigrants who knew how to fish. And Pike Place Market was also a huge welcoming ground for the Japanese community. So the Japanese markets at Pike Place really thrived before the war, for World War II. It's estimated that as many as 4/5 of the fishermen and farmers selling produce at the markets were Japanese Americans before the war. So as I learned about this really strong connection between the Sephardic Jewish and Japanese cultures, fishing became this big theme of my characters. But like I said, that wasn't the only thing they had in common. These communities lived in the central district. So because of redlining practices, immigrants and minorities were blocked from renting or buying in other neighborhoods. So this unique community formed there, where people from different backgrounds live close up against each other. And the area has a rich cultural history that can still be found today. Um, and as I started to dive deeper into the history of the area, I started to think, about my own memories of the CD. Um, when I was a kid, we lived in the suburbs, but I'd tag along with my papu to the city and hit the central district to run errands all the time. And, he loved to take me through the old neighborhoods, tell me old stories about growing up in the central district. We'd usually take a detour and grab some dim sum or cioppino at one of the fish markets. Um, and where he always seemed to know the owners. It's like wherever we went, he always seemed to kind of know everybody. Um, and as a kid, I never really understood why we had to drive all the way to the city just to go to the bank or pick up some salmon for Passover. But looking back, I think he just really wanted to stay connected to that community there. He was from a family of Sephardic Jewish immigrants. Most of his family overseas had been wiped out during the Holocaust. And the Central District was a place full of people with similar backgrounds. And he felt really comfortable there. So when I started this project, my papa wasn't around anymore, but I decided to do exactly what we used to do together. And so I jumped in my car and headed to the city and started to do some exploring. And I started to do some drawing too. So here's my first sketch of the original Sephardic Behor Holim synagogue in the CD. And as I would come across important landmarks and settings, I would snap some pics and start sketching as well. This is the location of the real Ferry Dock Tavern, which the real Marco Calvo ran and owned. This was a setting I used for many of my character scenes. As you can see, like a lot of these environments, they haven't changed. If you just remove the Starbucks sign, it's pretty much the same building. Hasn't changed much. And so, yeah, so the more I kind of immersed myself into these different environments, I was really able to kind of solidify the setting of the story. I put like important landmarks into the backgrounds of my scenes. This is Washington Hall, which was it is a historical public dance and music hall, which was the gathering place and settlement house for a lot of immigrant cultures. And it's still there and still very thriving and active. So yeah, as you can see, reference material was a big part of this process of creating this, graphic novel, visual story. And so I use a lot of reference material, and that's the same when I was designing my characters. So I looked at a lot of old pictures, some from family photos, others I found from the time period, excuse me, which I used to help create the characters of the story. And I also started using some of the information I was learning about where my family came from in my artwork. And then I also used a lot of old newspaper headlines and to set the time frame of some of my scenes. If you read the book, you'll notice some of the chapters start with, the main character Marco reading the paper, and it kind of happened by accident because as I was doing research, I would like get kind of caught up in the timeline, and I would look up an old like New York Times article or Seattle Times article, and then I was like, oh, I'm just gonna have the character read the paper and read the headlines because that's what people used to do back then. I have strong memories of my papu every morning reading the entire paper, which you don't see much anymore. So that's kind of a shout out to that as well. Um, I also used a lot of reference materials I found online. And I'd start kind of compiling images to draw from when creating my scenes. You can kind of see that here. I kind of pieced together some images as a reference and use those to draw from. Um, but every once in a while I have an idea for a character pose and I just can't find a reference for that. And I have a trouble envisioning it in my head. And so I have this trick that I use, which is to have my family pose for me. So I like to show these photos. My family is constantly subjected to me rushing into their rooms, interrupting what they're doing, forcing them to get into some strange pose. I take their pictures to draw from, but a lot of times I'll come back in right away and make them do a pose again from a different angle. A lot of times I'll ask them to use props, and they have no context for what is happening or why. Honestly, I don't think they really care that much anymore. But I like to show these just a little bit about my drawing process because having live-in reference models makes my job a heck of a lot easier. But if you're an artist or know someone, this is just a great resource to use to just kind of, if you picture something in your head and you just can't get the proportions right, it's just a great have your family and friends get into some pose. It really helps out. Um, so yeah, so in the same way that I really rely on reference material for my artwork, the same goes for writing my scenes and storylines. So I really wanted all the things that happened to my characters to come from, really to come from true stories or anecdotes that I'd pick up along the way in interviews and archives. I wanted that just to have all my chapters come from some sort of real scene or real anecdote. Um, and one of the most valuable places for source material that I discovered throughout this whole process was densho.org. So for those who don't know, Densho is kind of the Japanese incarceration archive. It's kind of the place to go. It's based here in Seattle. Um, and this is where I started to learn about what happened to the Japanese American community here in Seattle during the war. So, not sure how it was for the audience here, but for me, I barely learned anything about this time period when I was in school. I mean, I learned a ton about the Holocaust, which was a big part of my education at home, and at Hebrew school, and even in public school. Um, but the incarceration camps were barely a small blip that we brushed over in history class. And what I definitely didn't piece together until working on this project was that these events were happening, simultaneously. And so, the main character in We Are Not Strangers is kind of faced with this dilemma. So as a Jew, he's relying on the United States as an ally against the Nazis. And at the same time, his Japanese American friends and neighbors are being forced into camps right here in America. This is something I hadn't even thought about. And when I discovered the Densho archive, I started to learn a lot of things I had never heard before. And I'll just go through a few of those. So a few of the basics. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, 120,000 Japanese Americans were stripped of their rights and forced into camps under suspicion of disloyalty to the United States. Most people lost everything, including property, businesses, and possessions. 2/3 of those imprisoned were born right here in America. They were native-born American citizens. And not one prisoner was ever found guilty of any crime. And when they were released, they came home to virtually nothing. Most people had to start their lives over completely from scratch. Um, but there were these really rare stories of people who did reach out to help, especially in these communities where people from different backgrounds got to know each other as friends. There's stories of people who rented out their neighbors' homes for them and collected rent money to pay the mortgage, like in Marco's family story. There's stories of people helping by keeping businesses afloat, storing people's possessions for them, caretaking properties, so that when they were finally released from the camps, their neighbors still had something to come home to. And the more stories I heard like this, and I learned about, I could kind of weave them into my narrative with dialogue and images and stuff like that. So yeah, connecting with other people, hearing their stories added a ton to my project. And I spent a lot of time on Densho learning about this time period, researching these stories, watching video oral history archives, pulling source material from my scenes and stories. And eventually I decided to reach out to Densho for help, and they were absolutely awesome. The historians and staff at Densho provided multiple read-throughs of my work, gave me feedback, and helped by pointing me in the direction of other resources, so I could tell the story in more detail. So Densho was founded by Tom Ikeda, who he wanted to document and share World War II Japanese American incarceration history. He conducted over 250 video oral history interviews. And there's one story, one interview that he told me about that I wanted to share with you. And it's the story of Aki Kurose. So people in Seattle would definitely recognize her name. She was a very well-known educator and peace activist. And Seattle Public Schools even honored her by naming a middle school after her. And in 1941, she was a 10th grader at Garfield High in Seattle. And that's when Pearl Harbor was bombed, which in this interview she recalls in great detail. And after the initial shock and chaos that followed, she remembers going back to school. She remembers walking to class, and one of her favorite teachers approaches her and confronts her and says, "You people bombed Pearl Harbor." And in this video, Aki kind of talks about how threatened she felt all of a sudden, and how up until that point, she thought of herself as just a normal American kid. She was popular, friends in the community, but suddenly, just like that, she was thought of as the enemy. And this is one of the themes I really wanted to kind of address in the book. I was definitely asking myself when learning about this, how is it even possible that people's friends and neighbors in their own communities can so quickly change into becoming their enemies like that? And from what I've learned, this doesn't just happen out of the blue. The media, politicians can kind of promote this climate of fear and misinformation. As we all know, sensational news really sells. And during times of conflict, the narrative of dehumanizing certain groups of people and making them seem dangerous can spread really, really fast. And these messages can be really powerful, which makes it really hard for people to go against that. And that's why it's, really rare that we hear stories about people who reached out to help during that time. But one of the things they talk about at Densho is the idea of bystanders and upstanders. And I really love this idea. So the character in We Are Strangers is an upstander. Obviously, he goes against what he's being told, reaches out to his friend just to find out how he can help, and they work together to create a plan. This takes a lot of courage and compassion. Most people, however, tend to be bystanders. They may not know that something doesn't feel quite right, or people aren't being treated very fairly. But most people, choose to sit back and watch, to wait and see how things play out before getting involved. They might grumble and complain to themselves or their friends, but they don't really take any real action. So that's something I really wanted to highlight as well, is, the power of reaching out to people in our communities that are targeted as dangerous or treated unfairly, and see what we can do to help them out. I also want to take just a few minutes to talk about the power of working with, with organizations. So as you can probably tell by now, I learned so much during the process of creating this book. As an artist, I'm usually just isolated, heads down in my own world and my own work. But when I reached out to University of Washington and Densho, it added so much to my story, collaborating with historians and staff, and not only helped make sure I got my history right, but they also, provided inspiration for my storytelling and allowed the project to really grow, and also created really long-lasting relationships. Devin, professor in art at University of Washington, he ended up writing the afterword for We Are Not Strangers, which is a really fascinating work about kind of Sephardic Jewish history and the parallels between the Japanese and Sephardic cultures. And then, yeah, I continue to work with Densho on events and resources and stuff like that. Some of the other organizations that helped me, one was For Culture, which is a local organization. It's a grant and funding workshop. They provide grants and public art programs and stuff like that. I had never applied for a grant before, and this is the first time I did that, and it was a really great experience. I like to say that because for artists who are kind of kicking off a project and they're kind of struggling to get it started, this is such a great way to do it, because it makes you get organized, get feedback early and encouragement. And yeah, just wanted to shout out that process. I also hooked up with the Washington State Jewish Historical Society, which is similar to Densho in that they have amazing archives and resources and events. They were just a great resource for photos and history. And yeah, so if you're interested in Sephardic or just Jewish history in the area, definitely check them out. There was a ton of other organizations that helped. This slide is always makes me laugh because it makes me look like I'm like was a professional researcher when I started this, like I had a plan or something. But to make it clear, this all just kind of happened by accident. I would talk to people and they'd be like, "Oh, you should talk to this person over here. They might know something," and point me to other resources. And I just kind of would follow the leads that way, which really helped my project to grow. I also relied on conversations and feedback I had from local authors. Special shout out to Ken Mochizuki, who is the author of Baseball Saved Us. He wrote that foreword for We Are Not Strangers, which was a really cool connection. And yeah, so let's see what else. Oh yeah, and so all the information I learned along the way can be found in the back matter of the story. I kept track of all my notes. And when I got published, my publisher decided that they wanted to include all this information. And I was really glad they did. All this detailed information is a great resource for anyone who wants to dive deeper into the history. Um, and for teachers, if you know any teachers, there's also an accompanying education guide for the book, which was created by educators who worked with the publisher. This guide is perfect for educators who want to kind of utilize this story in their curriculum, which has been really, really amazing to see that happen in schools, not just in the local area, but across the country, which I can do virtual talks with and stuff. That's been really, really neat. Always was my favorite way to learn history, was through a narrative-driven story like this. Um, so yeah, actually, let me see. Well, the other thing I want to kind of go through before I wrap up is, as you can tell, I've learned a lot of information along the way from organizations and authors and stuff like that. But I wanted to take a second to talk about some of the power of talking and just interviewing people in my community and how much that added to the story. So a lot of times in interviews, I'd hear people mention an important landmark that I could incorporate into the background of one of my scenes, in the artwork. Um, but sometimes I'd have conversations with people that would turn into a completely new chapter. And so I was going to show a few examples of that. So one example, I knew the Sephardic Bikor Cholim synagogue was, a really important Seattle Central landmark that I wanted to include, but I didn't know what temple was like back in the 40s. But I started asking around more and more, and one of my mom's best friends had early childhood memories of growing up and going to synagogue. And she told us about the women's section in the balcony where people would gossip and shush each other during the service while the rabbi was trying to speak. So I used that as the foundation of one of my chapters. Um, Another example of a conversation that led to a whole new chapter. So we have a family friend. Her name is Linda Soyama, and she owns the Azuma Gallery here in Seattle. If you're ever here, gotta go check out that gallery. It's an amazing Japanese fine art gallery with woodblock prints, and yeah, really definitely a really, really amazing place. And I went to visit the gallery and to talk to Linda about my project, and she brought out these Japanese woodblock prints. And the prints kind of became this focal point of this scene of a father teaching his daughter about their family origins. So yeah, the artwork just kind of ended up being this unique way for my characters to discuss their family history. Okay, so there's one more example I want to talk about. So I kept hearing about Link's Tackle Shop from people I was interviewing. It was a Japanese American owned store in the Central District. And I knew the tackle shop would be a great setting for one of my scenes. Actually, some people I would talk to, they're like, if you're going to write this book, you have to include Link's Tackle Shop. There's just no doubt. Um, and so I got in touch with the owners, Jerry and Maria Beppu, who were they were nice enough to invite me into their home for an interview. Got to know them. I told them, and then when we were interviewing, our first interview, I told them that my story, when I told them that my first story was about highlighting people who reached out to help their neighbors during the war, when they heard that, they both just kind of looked at each other and smiled. And Jerry told me the story of his dad, an immigrant from Japan who struggled to make a living in Seattle. Um, but before the war, his tackle shop was really starting to take off. It was getting popular. The family was feeling stable. And one day he took his family up for a day of skiing at Snoqualmie Pass, right up the hill here. Um, and when they drove back into Seattle, that's when they found out Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And it wasn't long after that they were forced to close the tackle shop, evacuate to Puyallup Fairgrounds Assembly Center, which where they would be held for months before being put into permanent camps. And after years of living in the camps, the family finally returned home. And to their surprise, a Jewish insurance agent, friend of theirs, had continued to pay their insurance premiums while they were away. And when the policy matured, the family received a payout and they were able to reopen Link's Tackle Shop. This insurance agent even checked up on the shop while they're away, stored some supplies for them. There's a lot more to this incredible story. I was actually able to record my interview with them, and it's available on Densho on the archive there if you want to check it out. But this is just another example, amazing example of a kind of another similar story. And it was just such a cool moment for me because I was just going in there to, interview these folks to, get some ideas for a scene at the shop. And it turned out to be just another one of those remarkable stories of allyship. Okay, so to kind of wrap up, so this book has been out for over a year now. And over the past year at events, I keep getting asked, why I think these stories are so relevant today. And, you know, there's still a lot of ignorance and violence out there, as we unfortunately see in the news all the time, which affects our communities right in our own neighborhoods. And sometimes it feels like, the cycle of conflict is just never going to end. I know I'm not the only one that's felt pretty hopeless over the course of the past year. But for me, these true stories of real people from different backgrounds working together, helping each other out during uncertain times, I think we can all agree that's something we need a lot more of these days. And, sometimes it almost feels like we're encouraged to look at each other as strangers in a lot of ways. And, I just hope that the stories that I've highlighted in this book can act as a reminder that it just doesn't have to be that way. Thank you so much for having me again. And yeah, I would love to take your questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that really amazing presentation. So we do have some questions, and for those of you who are out there, you can continue to put questions in the Zoom Q&A. But I want to start with probably a somewhat easy question.
Sure.
How did you come to We Are Not Strangers as the title?
Oh, it's a great question, actually. It's one of my favorites because I had a working title. I had a different working title for this book. And when I got a publisher, we were coming up, they wanted to go with something else. And we went back and forth on titles for it was almost a year. And as I was, finalizing and we couldn't land on anything. I knew at some point I definitely wanted to do something with the stranger because it's definitely a theme of the story. It comes up quite a bit. And then my wife one day, I had many nights with my wife trying to brainstorm ideas. And then one day she just said, "We are not strangers." And I was like, "That's it." And sent it to the publisher and they were like, "That's it." So after a long, grueling amount of like hundreds of different titles, this is what we landed on.
That's awesome. And I think the kind of family influence that leads us to another question. How did the rest of your family react to hearing this history? And because it sounds like your grandfather didn't speak about it very much, so how did they react?
Yeah, that was really surprising. It's been really amazing because of course, everyone reacted, wanted to know more of the details and all the information we found. But probably the most rewarding thing about this is there's all these other little local stories that have popped up, especially in this area, because this was a big book here in Seattle, and it was promoted widely, and there was a lot of, especially in the Jewish community, and all these other little stories just started coming out of the woodwork, and so many, in fact, that I can't even document them all. It was just really, really neat and inspiring to hear about that. So that was probably my favorite reaction.
That's awesome. Um, so you talked at the beginning about how the story kind of came about because some of the people that your grandfather helped came to his funeral.
Mhm.
Have you been in contact with any of those people, and how have they reacted to the book as well?
Yeah, it's been really fun to connect with the Japanese community. So, in one family in particular, I have been in touch with, and it's both rewarding and confusing because it's really neat to connect, but there's also so many missing parts to the stories, and like people who are like, I think they helped my family. Like people really like to glom onto this and identify with it. Which I'm like, have at it. That's one of the most amazing things to to identify with.
Mhm.
But I mean, I could go on and on, but like short answer is yes, I have been fortunate enough to, like I said, be invited into some of the homes of people who have helped, not just whom our family was involved in helping, but so many others that have helped in way more impactful ways. Um, and yeah, I mean, and then also on the event side, I've done multiple events where it's the Jewish and Japanese communities together in a larger event, and to see that happen, um, and even for and other communities coming together, it's just really neat to see this story that's like has echoes of today, like these people coming together and telling their stories from the past and how it relates to today, and yeah, so yeah, connecting with those families and the whole community has been a really incredible experience.
That's awesome. Do you like from your research, did you find that your grandfather's Jewish background influenced his decision to help people during the war, or do you think it was kind of separate? How does that play in?
Yeah, I mean, we'll never know, but I think that like like my whole talk is about, it's kind of about that environment, but that creates that relationship. But there are some strong, um, I'm blanking on the Jewish philosophy of giving,
Oh,
and what
Tikkun
and the
Olam.
thank you, and the levels, and the level of like not and being anonymous and not telling someone, I think that's definitely a theme that I incorporated into the story. If you read it, you'll get that by the end. It's kind of kept that close to his chest. And why is that? What I kind of left it like wanting to leave it as a mystery, like why did he help, and like why didn't he tell people? Because it's up for interpretation, and I think that we can all look at ourselves and think about what we would do, and what are you trying to get something out of this, or are you trying to help? And it's like, yeah, I just find that kind of fascinating. But yeah, he also might not want to tell people because it was dangerous to tell people at that time to help others, and so there's a lot of things that play into it. But I think that, hey, I definitely don't think that being Jewish would keep you from doing something like this. I'll tell you that right now. I think, like, especially in our community, I think most people who read this, especially for me, if I read something like this or hear this story, I'm like, of course I would do something like that. It makes it more real. It makes it more like accessible, that it becomes like no question. So.
For sure. And sort of along similar lines of questions you may or may not be able to answer, but do
Mhm.
you know if your grandfather and maybe some of the other people that are featured in the book who were able to help their neighbors, were they getting pressure to not help? Like not just from sort of the wider American community, but from within their own community as well.
Yeah, I mean, if I can go back to, let's see, I think I'm still sharing the slides. Yeah, I mean, look at this. I mean, it's full of, you know, do not, protect by speaking to somebody, you're putting American soldiers in danger, or there's all this propaganda out there. So I think it was immense pressure to, stay the course on, keep, for America. And so, yeah, I think that for the people I talked to, I mean, like I said, it is hard to answer because all these people are gone. But historians, when I talk to historians and I talk to people who studied this time period, yeah, I think that was it was an immense, really heavy time as far as that is concerned. So yeah, I think it really would, yeah, play a part in that.
For sure. So to kind of, shift gears a little bit,
Mhm.
so it's clear you did so much research, which is really amazing. And you got to learn a lot about your own family's history. Do you have any advice for people who want to learn more about their family's history and or maybe like the history of their community?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel kind of lucky because I didn't go on the mission of this with that in mind. I heard the story and I was like fascinated. I was like, that's really interesting. So if you have something like that in your and I guarantee you do, right? Everybody does. Every person you talk to, they've got some sort of graphic novel or movie or story in them, right? There's all these incredible stories. So I would say if that interests you, ask questions, talk to people, especially people who are older that they may not be around for that much longer. They have stories to tell. And ask other people about them and how that, and then the dots will connect. And I guess my only advice would be to just like, if you're just keep being interested, and the more you're interested and ask questions and get more information, the more interested you might become. I mean, this thing just kind of took over my life for a couple of years. It became so interesting. I thought it was going to be like a small little comic I'd put in the local Seattle Stranger paper or something, and then it turned into a full blown graphic novel, right? So you never know where that interest will lead you. But yeah, I guess that would be my biggest advice is just like ask questions and uh and maybe if there's if there's like a dead end and you're like, oh, this seems like a dead end, maybe try to think of, is there something similar that I could look into, or a place that was like that, or somebody, yeah, historian, or I don't know. Anyway, I'm just kind of going
Yeah.
off, but something like that.
No, that's awesome. And I mean, probably I guess because there was so much material, it makes sense to turn it into a novel, but was it
Mhm.
intimidating to create a graphic novel or was it exciting?
Yeah, I think it was. I think the intimidating part, I mean, I guess on the research part, that was intimidating for me because I was like, if I'm going to tackle something like this, I better get it right.
Mhm.
I'm not I'm more of a trained artist than I am a historian or research
Right.
person. So that was intimidating, but the coolest part about that was like when I would talk to somebody who really knows their stuff, they were so encouraging, and like, that really helped me kind of like keep focus and not be as intimidated that way.
Mhm.
Um, as far as the artwork part, you know, if you talk to anybody who does comics, it's definitely a daunting, intimidating experience to think about how much you have to draw and how much you have to like it's pretty laborious. It can be. Um, but I really fall back on like, even if you just do, I'm going to be drawing and doodling anyway. If you do a little bit every day, it's like it's amazing how fast things add up. It doesn't seem like it would because you're just like, this seems impossible. But and even me, for a person that I've done this,
Mhm.
I still, even I've got a couple projects. I'm like this. Sometimes I get that feeling of being like intimidated, and I'm like, this is impossible. It's insurmountable or something. And I think a lot of artists, writers, they have that feeling, and that's real, and it can be such a creative killer. It can stop you in your tracks.
Yeah.
But I just trust the fact that, like, for me, if I'm like, look at this drawing, like if I'm like, oh, I'm gonna draw that tree today,
Yeah.
just the tree. Just like it took me 10 minutes. I was just freaking, if you just keep that little foot in the door on something small, I'm gonna edit this one little thing. If you don't completely give up, if you just keep a little bit in there every day, it just, man, all of a sudden, boom, a year later, you're like, oh, I did something. So anyway,
That's
that helps
awesome.
with the being overwhelmed thing.
Yes, for
Yeah.
sure. That's
Mhm.
great. So I think, we've gone through, I think, pretty much everyone's questions, but I do just want to ask
Cool.
one final question. What are you working on next and what can we look out for?
Oh, cool. Well, yeah, I'm working on a couple new projects. One of them is a fiction story. It's completely not. yeah, it's a completely, it's more of like a heist story. It's very comic uh related. And that's through Fantagraphics. And then I'm doing another project with Abrams, who published We Are Not Strangers, which is another personal story. It's a memoir more about me growing up, and it's a very controversial subject. It's about street art and graffiti because I got into trouble doing that when I was a kid. And we're in the midst of a giant boom. I don't know how it is over there in the East Coast, but it's just kind of a fascinating subject about, art and the dilemma of, well, who owns public spaces, and just the whole thing is pretty fascinating. So we're tackling that subject. So that'll be interesting.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here with us this evening and for
Yeah.
sharing this amazing presentation. And I highly encourage everyone who is watching to purchase We Are Not Strangers, which you can do at the link in the chat. So thank you so much, Josh, for joining us this evening and for taking the time. If you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support, and also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. So Josh, thank you so much again. Thank you to everybody who joined us. Have a great evening, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.